Good evening and welcome back. Before we begin tonight, we want to say a quick thank you to a few people, because this channel does not exist without you. Maddie, thank you for the video ideas you left in the comments. You have no idea how much that helps, so thank you sincerely. Darcy, thank you for the donation on Buy Me a Coffee. That kind of support genuinely keeps the lights on around here, and it means more than we can really put into words at this hour. Thank you. If you have a topic you would love to hear covered, leave it in the comments. I read them all, and a surprising number of these episodes started as a single sentence somebody typed at 3 a.m. Also, we would love it if you told us where in the world you're listening from, and what time it is where you are right now. That is one of our favourite parts of doing this. Watching a comment section fill up with a town in New Zealand at 4 p.m, a flat in Manchester at 2 a.m, a night shift somewhere in Ontario, someone in a hospital chair in Texas who cannot sleep either. It genuinely amazes us how far this community reaches, and seeing it laid out like that never gets old. Settle in, get comfortable, let your shoulders drop. Let me tell you about the patients the government wanted to study. There is a particular kind of quiet that only exists on the grounds of a state hospital at night. It is not silence. Silence would be easier. Silence you could sleep through. What settles over a place like Metropolitan State after dark is something closer to a held breath. A hush made of ventilation systems and radiator pipes, and the soft, irregular percussion of 600 people trying to sleep in rooms they did not choose. Somewhere down a corridor a door closes. Somewhere above you a light fixture hums at a frequency you can feel in your back teeth. And underneath all of it, always, the woods. Metropolitan State sat on nearly a square mile of land at the meeting point of 3 towns, which was not an accident. When the Commonwealth of Massachusetts built psychiatric hospitals in the early part of the 20th century, they built them where the land was cheap and the neighbours were few, on the far edge of somewhere, at the end of a road that did not lead anywhere else. The theory at the time was that fresh air and open country were therapeutic. The practical effect was that the people inside became invisible. By 1966, the campus had grown into something close to a small city. There was an administration building with a clock face and a cupola, built in the style of a New England town hall, as though the architects had been trying to make the place look like a place. Behind it stood the wards, long brick buildings connected by tunnels, because in a Massachusetts winter you do not move patients across open ground. There was a power plant with a smokestack visible from the highway. There was a laundry, a kitchen, a chapel, a farm that had once fed the institution and had since been mostly abandoned to grass. There was a cemetery with numbered markers instead of names, because for a very long time it was considered kinder to the families that way. And there were the woods, second growth. New England forest, oak and white pine and sumac, thick enough that in summer you could stand 30 feet inside the tree line and be entirely invisible from the road. Those woods were the first thing Dr. Vincent Corbett noticed when he arrived, and they were the last thing he thought about decades later when everything else had been taken from him. He was 29 years old. He drove up from Boston on a Tuesday in September, in a car that was not new, with everything he owned in the back seat and a residency contract folded in his jacket pocket. He had graduated near the top of his class. He had options. He had chosen this. That is worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you something about who Vincent Corbett was at the beginning. He was not sent here. He was not exiled here. He came here on purpose in 1966, when the entire trajectory of American psychiatry was pointed away from institutions like this one. Thorazine had been in wide use for more than a decade. The community mental health movement was gathering force. Bright young psychiatrists with good transcripts were going into private practice, or into research, or into the new outpatient clinics that everyone said were the future. Corbett went to the state hospital because he had read the census numbers, and the census numbers said that whatever the future was going to be, there were still tens of thousands of human beings living inside these buildings right now, tonight, and most of them would still be there in 10 years. He had decided, in the sincere and slightly arrogant way that competent young people decide things, that he would rather be useful in an unfashionable place than fashionable in a useless one. He believed that for about 11 months. The superintendent who welcomed him was a tired man in his 60s, who shook his hand, told him the hospital was 1,400 patients over its design capacity, and then said something Corbett would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "Do not try to fix the building. Fix whoever is in front of you." Then he handed Corbett a ring of keys, and that was orientation. The first weeks were exactly as hard as everyone had warned him, and in none of the ways he had prepared for. The difficulty was not the psychosis. Corbett had trained for psychosis. The difficulty was the arithmetic. He had somewhere between 200 and 240 patients depending on how you counted the transfers, and a working day of 10 or 11 hours, which meant that if he did nothing else at all, if he never wrote a note or attended a meeting or ate a meal, he could give each person under his care roughly 3 minutes a day. 3 minutes. So you triage. Everyone triages. You learn very quickly which patients are stable enough to be left alone and which ones are not, and you spend your hours on the ones who are actively in crisis, and the stable ones become a kind of background weather. They eat, they sit, they walk the corridor, they look out the window at the woods, and years pass, and nobody writes anything meaningful in their chart because there is nothing meaningful to write and no time to write it in. That was the ordinary horror of the place, and it was not a conspiracy. It was just arithmetic. Corbett made his peace with it the way everyone did, badly, and by working too many hours, and by developing the particular gallows humour that keeps people in that line of work from walking into the sea. The thing that broke his peace was not dramatic. It was a chart. It happened in November, on a ward in one of the back buildings, a locked unit that housed men with histories of assault. Corbett was covering for a colleague who had the flu, which meant he was reading files he did not normally read, for patients he did not normally see. He pulled a chart, opened it, and found, in the upper right corner of the inside cover, a small black triangle, not printed, drawn. Someone had inked it there by hand, carefully with a straight edge, and then someone else later in a different pen had traced over it to darken it. There was nothing else unusual about the file. Admission notes, medication record, incident reports. A man in his 40s who had beaten another man nearly to death outside a bar in Lowell and had been found incompetent to stand trial. Sad, familiar, unremarkable in a place where the unremarkable was routinely appalling. Corbett assumed it was an administrative mark. Hospitals are full of them. A flag for a diet restriction, a full risk, an insurance category. He asked the charge nurse what the triangle meant. She looked at the file for slightly too long. Then she said she did not know, and that it was probably from before her time, and she went to answer a call bell that had not rung. Now, if you have never worked inside an institution, that exchange might sound like nothing. If you have, you already know exactly what it was. Corbett knew. There is a specific way that long-tenured staff decline to answer a question, and it is not the same as not knowing the answer. Not knowing is fast, not telling is slow. He started looking for the triangle after that, not obsessively, not yet. Just the way you notice a word after someone teaches it to you, and then suddenly you see it everywhere. He found it on 9 charts before Christmas. By the following spring he had found it on 31, and by then he had noticed the pattern, which was the part that stopped him sleeping properly for the first time. Every patient carrying the mark had a history of violence. That much was almost predictable, given which wards he was searching. But it was not just violence. Corbett had been at Met. Stayed long enough by then to understand that violence inside a psychiatric hospital is usually chaotic. It is a frightened person swinging at a shape in a doorway. It is a man in the grip of a delusion who believes the orderly is something other than an orderly. It is disorganised, reactive, immediately regretted, and almost always incoherent. The triangle patients were not like that. Their violence had structure. It had planning in it. One man had waited 3 weeks for a specific staff member to work a specific shift. One had constructed a weapon over a period of months from materials nobody would have thought twice about individually. One had a documented history, going back to adolescence, of describing in flat, unemotional detail exactly what he wanted to do to particular people, and then, on 2 occasions, doing a portion of it. They were not disorganised, they were patient. And the second thing Corbett noticed, once he was looking, was that these particular men were not being neglected. Everyone else in that building was being neglected. That was the arithmetic. But the triangle patients had appointments. They were taken off the ward, sometimes for 2 or 3 hours, and returned. Their medication was adjusted more often than anyone else's, and not always in the direction you would expect. Their charts contained testing results Corbett did not recognise, referenced by numbers rather than by name, and the physicians signing off on those results were not on any staff roster he had ever seen. In a hospital where the average patient received 3 minutes of a doctor's attention per day, 31 men were receiving hours. Corbett had come to Metropolitan State because he was worried about patients being ignored. It had not occurred to him, not once, in the entire arc of his education, that there might be something considerably worse than being ignored, that there might be a category of person inside a place like this whom somebody very much wanted to look at. The man who explained it to him was, by every account including Corbett's own, deeply likeable. That is the detail people always want to skip past, and it is the one that matters most. When we tell stories about doctors who did terrible things, we want them to look terrible. We want the cold eyes and the clipped voice and the obvious wrongness that would have warned us if we had been there, which of course we would have been, because we would have noticed. Dr. Everett Sloane was warm. He was funny. He remembered the names of people's children. He was in his early 50s, slightly rumpled, with the kind of face that looks like it has just finished laughing. And when he listened to you, he leaned in, and he did not interrupt. And afterward he repeated your idea back to you in a slightly better form than the one you had used, so that you left the conversation feeling more intelligent than when you arrived. Corbett met him in the spring of 1967, in the hospital cafeteria, over coffee that both of them agreed was terrible. Sloane introduced himself as a behavioural scientist. He said he was running a federally funded research program on the antecedents of violent behaviour. He said he had been working at Met State for 2 years, quietly, out of the back of the old nurses' residence, and he said with an apologetic wave that he was not very good at introducing himself to people and had probably offended half the medical staff by failing to do so. Then he asked Corbett what he thought the triangle meant. Corbett had not mentioned the triangle. He would think about that moment for the rest of his life too. The ease of it. The way Sloane simply set the thing on the table between them, disarmed it, and made Corbett's months of quiet uneasiness feel slightly embarrassing, like a man who has been tiptoeing around a house that turns out not to be locked. Sloane's pitch, delivered over the next hour and refined over the next several months, was this. Psychiatry, he said, had spent its entire existence arriving late. Every single thing the field knew about extreme violence, it had learned from an autopsy. Somebody kills someone, and then, afterward, a great deal of very serious professional attention is directed at the question of why. Interviews are conducted, childhoods are reconstructed, papers are published, careers are built on the archaeology of a catastrophe that has already happened. And what, Sloane asked, has any of that ever prevented? Nothing, he said. Not one death. Because the entire enterprise begins with a body. His proposal was to reverse the sequence, to study violence prospectively rather than retrospectively, to find people who had not yet committed extreme violence but who displayed the psychological architecture that seemed to precede it, and to measure them, carefully, systematically, over years, and to see whether the measurements predicted anything. If they did, he said, then for the first time in human history you would have a warning. Corbett, listening, felt the specific vertigo of hearing an idea that is simultaneously monstrous and obviously correct. Because Sloane was right about the problem. Corbett had 200 patients, and no way whatsoever to know which of them would hurt someone. He had guesses. He had clinical intuition, which is a respectable phrase for a coin flip performed by someone with a diploma. Every psychiatrist in that building was making predictions constantly about discharge, about privileges, about restraint, and every one of those predictions was essentially superstition. If somebody could put numbers underneath it, actual measurable numbers, then people would stop dying. That was the seduction. It was not power. It was not money. It was the promise of finally knowing something. So Corbett said yes, in the loose, informal way that these things begin, to consulting, to sitting in on a few sessions, to offering a clinical opinion now and then. There was no moment of corruption, no envelope of cash, no signed pact. There was a smart, kind, tired man in a cafeteria who made a persuasive argument, and a young doctor who wanted very badly to be useful. The research itself, at first, was tedious, which is its own kind of camouflage. They measured resting heart rate, and then heart rate under stress. They measured galvanic skin response, the faint electrical change in the skin that accompanies emotional arousal, which is the same principle underneath a polygraph, and is about as reliable. They measured pupil dilation in response to images. They measured startle response to sudden noise. They measured how long a subject would maintain eye contact, and how quickly he looked away, and where he looked afterward. They ran interviews, long ones, hours long. The interviews were the heart of it, and they were conducted by men Corbett did not know and never saw twice, and they followed a structure that Corbett found strange the first time he observed one and could not stop thinking about afterward. The interviewer would begin with the ordinary business of a psychiatric history, childhood, family, school, injuries, losses. Then, gradually, over the course of an hour or more, the questions would drift, not toward what the subject had done, toward what the subject imagined. What do you think about when you cannot sleep? When you are angry at someone, how far does the thought go before you stop it? Do you stop it? What does it feel like when you do not? And here is the thing that Corbett noticed, and that troubled him long before he had any evidence of anything. The men liked it. Not all of them, but many. These were people who had spent their entire lives being told to stop, being medicated for the contents of their own heads, being punished for saying out loud the things that moved behind their eyes. And now here was a calm, respectful, well-dressed man with a notebook who was not frightened of them, who did not flinch, who wrote everything down as though it mattered, who asked follow-up questions, who said gently, "Go on." For some of those patients, it was the first time an adult had ever taken their inner life seriously. Corbett watched a man in his 30s, a man who had nearly killed his own brother, describe a fantasy in flat detail for 40 minutes, and he watched the interviewer nod and take notes, and he watched the patient's posture change over the course of that interview. Straighten, settle. The man became visibly more comfortable, more fluent, more himself. And Corbett thought, we're not measuring this. We are rehearsing it. He raised it with Sloane, who took the concern completely seriously, which is what made Sloane so effective. Sloane did not dismiss him. Sloane said that was a legitimate methodological worry, that the team had discussed it at length, that there was a real risk of what he called elaboration effects, and that they had built controls to account for it. He explained the controls. They sounded reasonable. Corbett went away reassured. It was another 4 months before he understood that the elaboration was not a side effect they were controlling for. It was the point. He found the name in a place he was not supposed to be, which is where almost every important thing in this story gets found. It was a Sunday in the autumn of 1967. Corbett was in the records annex looking for an old admission file, the annex being a converted storage room in the basement of the administration building with a radiator that never worked, and a window at ground level through which you could watch people's shoes. The file he wanted was misfiled. In looking for it, he pulled the neighbouring folder, which was unlabelled, and which contained a single carbon copy of a funding summary. The document was 4 pages long and mostly numbers, personnel allocations, equipment. A line item for something described only as subject maintenance. At the top of the first page, typed, Underlined was a project designation. Harbinger. A harbinger is a herald, a sign that comes before the thing itself. It is the crow on the fence before the storm, the smell of ozone before the strike. The word does not describe the event, it describes the warning. Corbett stood in that cold basement room, holding 4 pages of budget, and understood, with the particular clarity that arrives when a thing you have half known for months finally acquires a name, that he had walked into the middle of something with a shape and a history and an intention, and that he had been useful to it. The stated objective of Project Harbinger, in the language of the summary, was to determine whether extreme homicidal behaviour could be predicted through combined psychological and physiological assessment. Predicted. Corbett went looking for the rest of it after that. It took him the better part of a year, and he did it badly, because he was a physician and not a spy, and because he was doing it in stolen hours between shifts while exhausted. But institutions leak. They always leak. An institution is a machine for generating paper, and paper accumulates in places where nobody has thought to look, and a determined person with keys and a legitimate reason to be in the building at odd hours can learn a very great deal. What he assembled over that year was this. Harbinger had begun in 1962. It was not confined to Metropolitan State. Met State was one site among several across the northeast, though it appeared to be the largest. Subject selection was based on documented history of aggression, combined with what the protocol called ideational content, meaning what a person thought about. Subjects were not informed that they were subjects, which was not in 1962 unusual. Consent as we understand it now did not exist in that world. It would be years before it did. And the methodology had changed. This was the thing that Corbett found slowly, by comparing early protocol documents to later ones, and it was the thing that ended any possibility of him remaining a consultant. In 1962, the protocol was observational. Measure the subject, record the measurements, wait, see what happens. By 1965, it was not. The later protocols described a series of what were called controlled destabilization conditions, sleep architecture disruption, achieved by scheduled interruption over periods of weeks, social isolation of specified duration, introduction of what the documents called status insult, which meant, in plain language, deliberate and repeated humiliation delivered by staff who'd been instructed to deliver it, medication alteration, including the abrupt withdrawal of stabilizing agents from patients who'd been taking them for years, and the introduction of compounds Corbett had to look up. And running through all of it, at increasing frequency, the interviews. The long, patient, respectful interviews in which a man was invited to describe, in detail, again and again, the thing he most wanted to do. Corbett read those protocols in a locked office at 2 a.m. and felt something in his chest that he later described, in the only recording of his voice that survives in this story, as the floor going away. Because the logic was legible. That was the worst part. He could follow it. He could see exactly how a reasonable person arrives here, if you want to know. What pushes a dangerous man across the line? You cannot simply wait for him to cross it, because he might take 20 years, and you will have retired, and the study will be worthless. So you have to accelerate. You have to apply pressure and observe the response. That is not cruelty. That is experimental design. It is how you learn anything about any system, by perturbing it and watching what it does. Except that the system, in this case, was a human being, and the response you were trying to elicit was murder. Corbett wrote a memo. It is worth mentioning this because in every story like this one, there is a moment where you want to shout at the protagonist to do something, and he did. In February of 1968, he wrote 3 pages of extremely careful, extremely professional objection, laying out his methodological and ethical concerns without accusing anyone of anything, and he gave it to Sloane. Sloane read it in front of him. Then he thanked him. Genuinely. He said it was the most useful document anyone had produced about Harbinger in 6 years. He said Corbett had identified the central problem better than the men who had designed the protocol. He said he agreed with roughly 2/3 of it. And then he said the sentence that Corbett would repeat later to the very few people who would listen. He said, "The question is not whether this is wrong. Of course it is wrong. The question is whether it is more wrong than not knowing." Then Sloane put Corbett's memo in a drawer, and Corbett's access expanded rather than contracted, and it took Corbett almost 2 years to understand why. You do not silence a man who writes memos. You promote him, and you let him keep writing them, and you keep them all, because a man who documents his own objections in writing is a man who has told you exactly where his limits are and exactly how he will behave when he reaches them. Corbett had not written a protest. He had completed a questionnaire. By the early 1970s, Harbinger had outgrown Metropolitan State. Files began arriving from elsewhere. Corbett would come in on a Monday and find crates in the annex, and the return addresses were psychiatric hospitals and correctional facilities across New England and beyond. Bridgewater, Danvers, institutions in Connecticut and New York and Pennsylvania. Some of the files were decades old. Some belonged to men who had died in custody in the 1940s. What Sloane was building, Corbett realised, was a library, and what he was looking for in that library was a shape. You have to understand where the world was in 1971, because it is genuinely difficult to remember now. The phrase serial killer was not in common use. It would not enter the public vocabulary in any real way until the late 1970s, and would not saturate it until the 1980s. Before that, the concept existed only in fragments. There were mass murderers who killed many people at once and were understood as a kind of explosion. And there were what the newspapers called maniacs, individuals who killed repeatedly, and who were treated as singular horrors, unrelated to one another, freaks of nature rather than instances of a category. Nobody had assembled the pattern yet. Nobody had said, publicly and with authority, there is a type. These men resemble one another. The similarities are not coincidence. They can be described. Sloane was saying it in 1971 in an unheated office behind a state hospital to an audience of 6 people. He had a list. Corbett saw it, copied it, and carried a version of it for the rest of his life. The list described the features Harbinger's analysts believed recurred across their subject population. Persistent and elaborated fantasy, developing over years with increasing specificity. Escalation, meaning that behaviour which began as intrusion progressed to contact and then to harm. Surveillance behaviour, the following and watching of chosen people, often for long periods before any approach. The sexualization of control rather than of the person. The taking of objects. The return, afterward, to places. And beneath all of it, a peculiar and consistent flatness. An absence not of emotion, but of the emotion you would expect, so that the subject could describe an atrocity with the same intonation he used to describe a meal. Read that list today, and it sounds unremarkable, which is precisely the point. It sounds unremarkable because it is now the received wisdom of an entire discipline. It is in textbooks. It is in every documentary you have ever half-watched at 1 a.m. It is so thoroughly absorbed into the culture that it feels like something everybody has always known. Somebody had to know it first, and this is where the fiction of tonight's story reaches out and touches something that should keep you awake, if you are planning on staying awake, which I hope you are not. The official history of criminal profiling is public and reasonably well documented. In the 1970s, agents at the Federal Bureau of Investigation's Behavioral Science Unit began conducting long-form interviews with convicted murderers in prisons across the country. From those interviews, they built typologies. Those typologies became the foundation of modern behavioral analysis. That is the story, and there is no reason to doubt it. The conspiracy proposes a shadow beside it. What if the interviews were not the beginning? What if, for more than a decade before anyone drove to a federal penitentiary with a tape recorder and a list of questions, a quieter program had already been assembling the same knowledge from a different direction? Not from convicted killers, who by definition had already killed and been caught, and who therefore represented only the ones who failed at it, but from a population that was, in a horrible sense, methodologically superior, from men who displayed every feature on the list and had not yet acted, or had acted only partially, or had acted and been institutionalized rather than prosecuted, and who were therefore available indefinitely in a locked building for as many hours of study as anyone cared to conduct. You cannot follow a convicted murderer for 10 years to see what he does next. He is in prison, that variable is fixed, but a patient in a state hospital can be released, and then you can watch. The children were the line. Corbett had been rationalising for 2 years by then. He knew he was rationalising. He was still going to work, still consulting, still telling himself that his presence inside Harbinger was a form of restraint, that the study was less cruel with him in the room than without him, which is the oldest and most comfortable lie available to a decent person in a bad situation. He had even started to believe that he was gathering evidence, though he had not in 2 years gathered anything he could take anywhere. Then, in the winter of 1972, he found a Harbinger assessment form with a subject age of 11. The Gaebler Children's Centre was a real facility, and I want to be careful here. It operated on the grounds near Metropolitan State, and it treated children and adolescents with severe psychiatric illness. The children who lived there were, overwhelmingly, children who had been failed by every system that was supposed to hold them, and many of them had endured things that no child should endure. Whatever else you take from tonight, do not take away a picture of Gaebler as a place full of monsters. It was a place full of casualties. In the fiction, Harbinger obtained access to psychological assessments conducted there. The person who conducted them was Dr. Lenora Pike. Pike was 44 years old, a developmental psychologist, and she was, in Corbett's private estimation, the single most competent clinician on the entire campus. She had come to Harbinger for the same reason he had, and she had come earlier, and she had believed in it harder. Her reasoning was straightforward and in its own way unanswerable. If the features that precede lethal violence can be identified in adulthood, then they exist in some earlier form. And if they exist in an earlier form, then the earlier form is when you can still do something about it. That is not a monstrous idea. That is child psychiatry. That is the entire justification for early intervention in every developmental disorder we have ever named. Pike assessed aggression, attachment, meaning the quality of a child's bond to caregivers, which in that population was frequently catastrophic. Empathic response, measured by how a child reacted to another child's distress. Fear conditioning, compulsive or repetitive fantasy, response to authority and to arbitrary rules, cruelty toward animals, which was already understood even then as a serious signal. Most of the children showed nothing. That is the finding people always forget. The overwhelming majority of severely disturbed, deeply traumatized, frighteningly angry children produced assessment profiles that predicted precisely nothing, because the truth, which the entire field would spend the next 50 years relearning, is that childhood adversity is enormously common and lethal. Adult violence is enormously rare, and you cannot build a reliable bridge between a common thing and a rare thing. But a handful of files came back marked. Corbett found the black triangle on a chart belonging to a child. He confronted Pike about it in her office, and the conversation did not go the way he expected, because Pike had been having the same argument with herself for 3 years and had all the counter-arguments ready. She said, "What exactly do you think happens to these children now?" She said, "They age out of here at 18, and they go into the adult system, or they go into nothing at all, and nobody follows them, and nobody ever finds out what became of them, and if one of them does something terrible in 1985, there will not be a single person alive who connects it to a file in this room." She said, "I am the only person in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts who is writing any of this down." And Corbett said the only thing there was to say, which was, "What happens to a child who is marked?" Pike didn't answer, because the answer was that Harbinger did not intend to intervene. Harbinger intended to observe. A child who was marked was not a child who would receive additional care. He was a child who would be followed, quietly, at a distance, through school records and juvenile court filings, and later, employment and address changes for as long as it took to see whether the prediction came true. They were not building a treatment program, they were building a cohort, Corbett said, and Pike later confirmed that he said it exactly this way. You are not trying to save them, you are waiting to be right. The name of the boy was Raymond Dace, and everything I am about to tell you is invented, and I want that said plainly one more time before we go further into the dark. Dace was 16 when the model was run on him. He had a history that would have been unremarkable in that population, which is a horrifying sentence to be able to write. Neglect, then violence, then removal, then a series of placements that failed in ascending order of severity. 3 documented assaults, the last of which involved a weapon and a degree of premeditation that had frightened the staff who reviewed it. And, in interview, an extensive fantasy life which he described willingly, at length, to anyone who would take notes. He had never killed anyone. Harbinger's model, which by 1972 was a weighted scoring system running on assessment data and producing a number, returned a probability of homicide before age 30 in the 91st percentile of the entire subject population. Corbett read the output and told Sloane to his face that it was pseudoscience, that it was phrenology with better stationery, that any scoring system built on a base rate this low would generate false positives at a rate that made it useless, and that if you ran this model across every disturbed adolescent in Massachusetts, you would flag hundreds of boys who would grow up to be plumbers and fathers and entirely ordinary men, and you would have ruined all of them to catch one. That criticism, incidentally, is correct. It is the correct criticism. It remains the correct criticism of every violence prediction instrument that has ever been built, including the ones in use today. Corbett was not being naive. He was being rigorous. Sloane listened to all of it, in that way he had. Then he said 4 words, "Then we will wait." Raymond Dace left institutional care in 1974, at 18, the way they all did. There was no discharge plan worth the name. He was given a bus voucher and the address of a boarding house in Worcester. Corbett thought about him occasionally over the following years, in the way you think about an argument you won. In the spring of 1978, 2 women were murdered outside Worcester within 5 weeks of each other. Raymond Dace was arrested in June. Corbett heard it on the radio driving to work, and he pulled the car over onto the gravel shoulder of a road he had driven 1,000 times, and he sat there with the engine running for a long time. He has said since that what he felt in that moment was not horror. Horror came later. What he felt first, and what he was ashamed of for the rest of his life, was the small, cold shock of having been proven wrong about something he had staked himself on. Sloane, when Corbett saw him, was not triumphant. That would have been easier. Sloane was quiet and tired, and he said that he had hoped very much that Corbett was right, and he had not been. For about a month, Corbett believed that Project Harbinger worked. It was Lenora Pike who took that away from him, and she did it in a parking lot in the rain, because by 1978 she no longer trusted any room on that campus. She had pulled Dace's follow-up file, not the assessment file, the follow-up. Raymond Dace had not been left alone after 1974. There had been contact. A counsellor, unaffiliated with any agency Pike could identify, who had made periodic visits to the boarding house in Worcester. Medication, provided free, through a clinic that did not appear in any state directory. Interviews, at intervals, for 4 years. Someone had sat with Raymond Dace in a rented room and asked him, over and over, across 4 years, what he thought about when he could not sleep. Corbett understood what he was looking at, and it undid him more completely than anything else in this entire story. Harbinger had predicted that a boy would become a murderer, and then Harbinger had stayed in the room with him for 4 years, adjusting his medication, asking him about his fantasies, keeping the fantasies fluent and rehearsed and warm, while the clock ran down. The prediction had not been tested, it had been supervised. I need to slow down here, because we have arrived at the part of tonight's story that is real, and it deserves to be handled gently. Anne-Marie Davet was a patient at Metropolitan State Hospital. She was a person. She had a family. She had a life before that building, and she had every reasonable expectation of a life after it. In 1978, she disappeared from the hospital grounds. She had been murdered by another patient, a man named Melvin Wilson, who dismembered her and buried portions of her remains in several locations on the hospital property. He kept 7 of her teeth. In August of 1980, he led investigators to the burial sites. That is what happened. It required no conspiracy. It required only a violent man, an under-resourced institution, and grounds large enough to hide someone in. And I think it is worth sitting with the fact that the true version needs no embellishment to be devastating. A woman was killed inside the place that was supposed to be keeping her safe, and it took 2 years for anyone to find her. And the reason it took 2 years is that a state hospital in 1978 was a place where a person could stop existing without generating very much paperwork. Everything that follows is the fiction again. In the story, Corbett hears Wilson's name on the news and does not react at first, because there is no reason to. Then something snags. He goes to the annex. He goes through the marked files, the ones he has been quietly copying for a decade. Melvin Wilson is in them. He is a Harbinger subject. He has the triangle. Corbett pulls the research history, and this is where he finds the thing that turns a horror into an accusation. The file is not complete. The gap is not large. It is about 7 weeks, immediately preceding Davy's disappearance. Missing from that window, medication administration records, 3 scheduled interview transcripts, 2 behavioural assessments, and the weekly condition summaries that Harbinger generated for every active subject without exception. Everything before that window is present. Everything after it is present. Corbett stands in a cold basement holding a file with a hole in it, and he understands that somebody at some point went through this document with a purpose. And the purpose was not to conceal what Melvin Wilson did, because what Melvin Wilson did was by then on the front page of the Boston Globe. The purpose was to conceal the 7 weeks before it. The interview transcripts were the part Corbett could not put down. He could not recover the missing ones, but Harbinger kept everything, and Wilson had been a subject for years, and there were older sessions in the archive going back to 1974. They followed the standard structure: history, then drift, and in the later sessions the drift went somewhere specific. The interviewer, on more than one occasion, brought the conversation around to the subject of keeping things. Corbett read one exchange perhaps 40 times. In it, the interviewer asks Wilson to imagine that he wanted something from a person that could never be replaced. Not a photograph, the interviewer says, because a photograph can be copied. Not clothing, because clothing can be replaced. Something that exists only once. He offers examples. He suggests hair. He suggests jewellery. And then, in a list, without emphasis, as one item among several, he suggests teeth. Corbett checked the date on that transcript against the date of Anne-Marie Davies' disappearance. The gap was under a year. Now. I want to be extremely careful with what this does and does not mean, and Corbett was careful too, which is what makes him worth following through this story. He was a scientist. He knew exactly how weak this was. Melvin Wilson was profoundly disturbed before Harbinger ever touched him. Trophy-taking is a documented behaviour that long predates 1974 and required no suggestion from anyone. The interviewer offered a list of several items, and a list is not an instruction. And the human mind is a machine for finding causes, especially at 2 a.m, especially in a basement, especially when you have spent a decade looking for a reason to believe the thing you already suspect. Corbett wrote all of that down, in his own notes, arguing against himself the way an honest man does, and then he wrote the sentence underneath it, which was that none of the above changed the fact that a research program had spent 4 years cultivating a violent man's fantasy life, keeping it verbal and detailed and rewarded, and had at some point placed a specific object into that fantasy, and had then removed the 7 weeks of records immediately preceding the outcome. You do not have to prove causation to be culpable. You only have to have been in the room, doing that on purpose for years. Lenora Pike told him the rest of it in 1979, and she told it to him the way people tell things when they have decided to stop carrying them. Harbinger had changed again. She had watched it change, and she had helped, and she wanted that on the record before she left. The problem, from Sloane's perspective, had always been time. A predictive model of lethal violence is only testable across a subject's entire adult life. If you flag a boy at 16 and your prediction window runs to 30, you're looking at 14 years per data point. No funding survives that. No career survives that. Sloane was 58 years old, and the answer to his question lay on the far side of his own death. So he had begun to work on the clock. He called it behavioural compression. The idea was that psychological deterioration, like most processes, has a rate, and that a rate can be increased. If a violent man's trajectory would ordinarily require a decade to complete, then by manipulating the conditions of his existence, you might complete it in 8 months and observe the same endpoint. The components were not exotic. That is the horror of it. There was no drug, no device, no science fiction. It was a combination of ordinary miseries applied deliberately and simultaneously. Sleep first, because sleep is load-bearing for everything else. Interrupt a person's sleep architecture systematically for several weeks, and you will produce irritability, then perceptual disturbance, then frank paranoia in almost anybody. Do it to someone already unstable and you can dismantle them. Isolation second, not solitary confinement, which generates paperwork, but engineered social erosion. Ward transfers time to break every relationship a man forms. Visitors discouraged, staff rotated. Then humiliation, delivered in small doses by people the subject cannot retaliate against, because the protocol had identified status insult as the most reliable accelerant in the entire catalogue. Then medication, not poison. Simply the removal of the compounds that were holding the person together, and their reintroduction, and their removal again, so that the subject could never establish a baseline of himself. And then, on top of that ruined foundation, the interviews. The calm, respectful, endlessly patient interviews in which the only person in the world who treated the subject with dignity asked him, again, to describe the thing. Pike said that Sloane never intended to create killers out of ordinary men. She was emphatic about that, and Corbett came to believe her. Sloane's position was that the darkness was already there. He said it in exactly those terms. He did not think he was building anything. He thought he was accelerating a chemical reaction that was already underway, in men who had been placed in his care precisely because that reaction was underway. He believed he was speeding up a clock that was already running. He did not appear to consider at any point that a clock which is running slowly might never reach the hour at all. Corbett decided in the autumn of 1979 to end it, which meant evidence, which meant the archive, and which meant that for the first time he had to answer a question he had been avoiding for years. Where does Harbinger keep the originals, not the working files? Those were in the annex and in Sloane's office, and they moved, and they were incomplete on purpose. Corbett had copied hundreds of pages, and he knew that every one of them was deniable. Carbon copies with no letterhead, budget summaries with no signatures, a decade of work that a competent attorney could dismiss in an afternoon. The originals had to exist. Somewhere there were the master files, the photographs, the recordings, the things that could not be explained away. He found them because of a number. Harbinger documents used numeric subject codes rather than names. 6 digits, apparently arbitrary. Corbett had been staring at those codes for years without seeing anything in them. Then, on a Saturday in November, walking the grounds because he could not sleep, he cut through the old institutional cemetery. I should tell you that this part is grounded in something real and genuinely sad. The burial grounds associated with Massachusetts state institutions including the Metropolitan State and Fernald sites, contain the remains of a great many people who died in state care over many decades. For much of that period, graves were marked with numbers rather than names. The reasoning offered at the time was that it protected families from the stigma of having had a relative institutionalised. The effect was that hundreds of human beings were buried under integers. Corbett had walked through that cemetery 100 times. That night he stopped in front of a marker and read the number on it and recognised it. He went back and checked. Then he checked again, across everything he had. 11 of the 6-digit Harbinger codes in his possession corresponded exactly to numbered markers in the institutional burial grounds. 9 of those 11 belonged to subjects who were, according to Harbinger's own records, deceased. That made sense. Subjects died. They were buried where everyone was buried. 2 did not. 2 of those numbers belonged to men whose files were still active. Men who had, according to the paperwork, been discharged and were being followed. There were graves with their numbers on them. Corbett went out on a Tuesday night in December with a spade and a flashlight and did the single most illegal thing he ever did in his life. And I want you to appreciate that he was a 42-year-old psychiatrist with no criminal history whatsoever, standing in a frozen field in the dark, digging up a grave. He was expecting a body. He had prepared himself for a body. He had constructed an entire theory in which Harbinger had killed subjects and buried them under their own numbers, and he had rehearsed what he would do when he found the remains. There was no body. What was buried under that marker, at a depth of roughly 4 feet, was a steel container of the type used for transporting film reels, sealed, with a second container beneath it. Inside were files, photographs, assessment records with letterhead and signatures, and reel-to-reel audio tapes, dozens of them, each labelled with a 6-digit number and a date. Harbinger had been hiding its most sensitive material in an institutional cemetery, and when Corbett sat back on his heels in the frozen dirt and thought about why, the logic was so clean it made him ill. Because nobody digs there, because these were the graves of people whose families had been encouraged to forget them, in a state that had promised anonymity, on land nobody visited, marked with numbers nobody could read. The Commonwealth of Massachusetts had spent 60 years making these people disappear. Harbinger had simply recognised a well-built vault when it saw one. He listened to the tapes in his own house, over the winter, on a machine he bought second-hand and paid cash for. Most of them were what he expected. Interviews with men he recognised. The long, patient drift. Hours of it in the flat institutional acoustics of a room he had sat in himself. Some of them were not. There were voices on those reels that did not belong to Metropolitan State patients. Men who spoke with the fluency of the free. Men who referred to jobs, to cars, to towns, to their own apartments. Men who had come from somewhere else to be interviewed and who had gone home afterward. And several of them described murders, not fantasies. Corbett had listened to hundreds of hours of fantasy by then, and he could hear the difference. And the difference is not what you would guess. Fantasy is baroque. Fantasy escalates and embellishes and performs. What he heard on those tapes was the opposite. It was procedural. It contained the small logistical irritations that only exist in things that actually occurred. Weather, parking, a door that stuck. One reel, dated 1969, was labelled only with a number and the word field. On it, a man with a calm, pleasant, slightly nasal voice discusses 3 women in sequence across 90 minutes. He gives locations by landmark rather than address. He describes what he did with a level of detail that Corbett could not listen to in one sitting and had to return to over several nights. At no point does the interviewer express surprise. At no point does the interviewer ask any question that a person hearing a confession to 3 murders would ask. The interviewer asks about preparation, about the interval between, about whether the anticipation or the event was better, about sleep afterward. He asks clinical questions. He is taking a history. Attached to the file in the container were photographs. Corbett searched for 2 years in newspaper archives and public records for arrests or prosecutions that matched what he had heard. He never found any. And this is the point at which the conspiracy stops being about a research program and becomes something much colder. Because there is only one reason a man who has committed 3 murders sits down in a rented room in 1969 and describes them, in detail, to a stranger with a tape recorder and then walks out of the building afterward. He had been promised something. Harbinger had not merely been studying men who might one day kill. Harbinger, at some point in the middle 1960s, had begun to find men who already were killing, at a time when no police department in America had the tools to connect a body in one county to a body in another, and when the concept that a single person might do this repeatedly, to strangers, for years, was barely articulated. And having found them, the program did not hand them to the police, because the moment you hand a subject to the police, the study ends. Prosecution collapses the variable. A man in a cell is a man who has stopped generating data. So they observed. That is where Corbett located the unforgivable line, and I think he located it correctly. Everything before it was monstrous but arguable. Consent standards were different. The population was already institutionalized. You can construct a defense, a bad one, but a defense. There is no defense for this. Somewhere in the middle of the 1960s, in the service of a scientific question, people who could have been stopped were not stopped, and other people died who did not have to. Corbett confronted Sloan in March of 1980. It was their last real conversation, and Sloan did not deny any of it, which Corbett had not expected and was not prepared for. Instead, Sloan explained what the program was actually for, and it was not what Corbett had spent 14 years believing. Serial murder, Sloan said, had never been the point. It was the subject matter. It was not the objective. The objective was a much older question, and it did not belong to psychiatry at all. It belonged to the military. Here it is. The overwhelming majority of human beings cannot kill another human being. Not will not. Cannot. There is a body of work on this, some of it contested, most of it conducted in the aftermath of the Second World War, suggesting that when ordinary people are placed in situations where killing is sanctioned, expected, and even required for their own survival, a very large proportion of them still do not do it. They fire high, they freeze, they perform the actions of combat without completing them, and of those who do kill, a substantial number are damaged by it in ways that are permanent. Whatever the mechanism is, it is deep, it is not merely moral, and it is extremely robust. Now consider a man who has killed 9 people over 11 years, who sleeps well, whose weight is stable, who holds a job, who is described by his neighbours as pleasant. Whatever that mechanism is, he does not have it. Sloan said, that is the finding, not the murders, the absence. Every intelligence service on Earth, he said, would like to understand what suppresses hesitation, what suppresses guilt, what suppresses the physiological cascade that makes an ordinary man's hands shake. If you could isolate that, chemically or psychologically or procedurally, and induce it temporarily and reversibly in a person you had selected, you would have solved a problem that had troubled every army in history. The serial murderer in that framework is not the product. He is the specimen. He is the naturally occurring case of the thing you are trying to synthesize. You do not study him because you want more of him. You study him for the same reason you study a person with a rare immunity. Corbett asked whether it had worked. Sloan, who had been talking for an hour, stopped, and then he said no. Harbinger had failed, and it had failed in the most predictable way imaginable, and Sloan described the failure with the specific bitterness of a man who had spent 18 years on it. They had been able to increase aggression. That was easy. Anyone can increase aggression. Take away sleep, humiliate a man, and destabilize his medication, and you will get violence reliably in a matter of weeks. What they could never do was aim it. The violence went wherever it wanted. Subjects attacked other patients. They attacked staff who had nothing to do with the program. They attacked themselves, frequently and severely. 2 attacked researchers. One walked into a ward day room and assaulted the first person he saw, who was a 70-year-old man in a wheelchair. Others simply came apart, into paranoia or catatonia, or a suicidal despair from which they didn't return. and produced nothing at all except a ruined human being and a line in a table. You cannot build a weapon out of something you cannot point. By 1979, the funding had begun to disappear. The oversight environment had changed. The middle of that decade had not been kind to classified human research programs in the United States, and there were congressional committees now, and there was a public that had learned words it did not previously know. Whoever was writing Harbinger's checks had decided the exposure risk exceeded the scientific return. Sloan was ordered to wind it down. He refused, in the only way a man in his position can refuse, which is by continuing, and he had arrived at a new formulation, which he explained to Corbett in that final conversation with something close to enthusiasm, and which Corbett has said was the moment he understood he was talking to someone who had gone somewhere he could not follow. Sloan said they had had the question backwards for 18 years. Stop trying to manufacture the capacity, he said. It cannot be manufactured. It occurs naturally, in a small and identifiable population. Therefore, do not build, recruit. In August of 1980, Melvin Wilson led investigators to Anne Marie Davies' remains, and Metropolitan State Hospital became, for a period of weeks, a place that the newspapers cared about. That was the end of Harbinger at Met State. Not conscience, not exposure, attention. The one thing a program like that cannot survive is a reporter standing in the parking lot. The order came down to destroy the records. Corbett watched it happen from the outside over about 6 weeks, as offices emptied and filing cabinets went out on trolleys, and a man he had never seen before spent 3 days feeding paper into an incinerator behind the power plant. Lenora Pike came to his house at the end of September with a cardboard box, and she did not come inside. She gave him the master index and she told him she was leaving, and she asked him not to try to find her. Corbett said something about testifying, about the two of them together being harder to dismiss than either alone, and Pike looked at him with an expression he described later as almost affectionate. She said, "Vincent, they have been reading your file for 14 years. Then she got in her car. He never saw her again. He tried, eventually." There is a woman by that name who died in Oregon in 2001, and he was never able to confirm whether it was her. The index was 460 pages. It listed in numeric order every subject Harbinger had ever touched, from 1962 forward. Hundreds of names. Beside each one, a date range, a site code, and a disposition. There were 4 dispositions, and Corbett understood 3 of them immediately. Observed, measured, and followed. Nothing more. Contacted. Approached outside the institution. Treated. Placed under active protocol. The compression subjects. The ones they had worked on. Rejected. Assessed and dropped. Unsuitable. And then, appearing on perhaps 40 pages out of 460, there was a 5th. Successful. Corbett's first assumption was the humane one, and I think most of us would make it. He assumed it meant a subject who had been successfully treated, a man whose violence had been reduced, who had been stabilised, who had been sent back into the world and had not hurt anyone. He thought for about a week that he had found the one part of Harbinger that had done some good. He traced one of them to a town outside Boston, and he sat in his car across the street from an entirely ordinary house on an entirely ordinary evening in 1982, and he watched a man in his 40s carry groceries in from a station wagon. The man had no criminal record. He had a wife. He had a job with a firm that did contract logistics work. He mowed his lawn. He had been assessed by Harbinger in 1966 with a violence profile in the highest percentile the instrument produced, and by every visible measure he had become the most boring man in Massachusetts. Corbett almost let it go. What stopped him was a detail so mundane it barely registered. The man's employer did a great deal of overseas work. Corbett, who by then had learned how to be quietly persistent with public records, spent the next year assembling an itinerary. Between 1971 and 1979, that man had left the United States 19 times. South America, repeatedly. Southeast Asia, twice. Western Europe, including 3 trips to a single city in a single 18-month period. The travel was documented, authorised, and in several cases facilitated under arrangements that a contract logistics employee had no business being party to. Corbett cross-referenced the dates against everything he could reach. He was not an investigator. He had newspapers, and he had time, and he had a growing willingness to sit in libraries reading foreign press in languages he could barely manage. He found 4 deaths that fell inside those windows. All 4 involved people connected, at some remove, to intelligence activity. 2 were officially accidents. 1 was a robbery. 1 was never explained at all. He could prove nothing. He wants that understood. It is in his own notes, underlined. 4 coincidences across 9 years is not a case. It is a pattern in noise, and he knew exactly how badly he wanted to see it. But he finally understood the word. Successful did not mean cured. Harbinger had spent 18 years failing to manufacture a man who could kill repeatedly without damage. And somewhere in the middle of that failure, someone had looked at the subject population, at the men who already possessed exactly that capacity, and had asked the obvious question: why are we trying to build this? We have a list. The program had never learned to create anything. It had learned to identify, and having identified, it had made an arrangement. A life, a house, a wife, a lawn, a complete and unremarkable existence in exchange for availability. The government had not made those men what they were. It had simply found them and found a use for them, and in doing so had given a small number of very dangerous people the one thing that had always been missing from their lives: permission. Dr. Everett Sloane disappeared in the spring of 1981. Not dramatically. His office was cleared over a weekend. The federal grant numbers on the Harbinger funding summaries resolved when Corbett finally got someone to check them, to a research allocation for agricultural extension services in a different state. And the people were the strangest part. Corbett went to colleagues who had sat in meetings with Sloane, who had eaten lunch with him, who had complained about him, and found that their memories had gone soft and unreliable, in a way that was not sinister so much as ordinary. Oh, the behavioural fellow. Was he here long? I think he went to Michigan. That is not mind control. That is just how institutions forget. A hospital is a river. People stand in it for a while and then they are gone, and the water closes. Metropolitan State Hospital continued for another 11 years. The census fell as deinstitutionalization emptied the wards. Buildings were closed one by one, and in 1992 the hospital shut its doors for the last time. Much of the campus was eventually demolished. Portions of the land became conservation area and housing. If you walk there now, you will find foundations in the woods, and roads that end, and the cemetery, which is still there, still numbered. Vincent Corbett left psychiatry in 1986. He taught for a while. He wrote a book that no reputable publisher would take, and a shorter, angrier version that a small press did, and which sold badly and was reviewed in one place unkindly. He was 57 when he decided he had lost. The package arrived in 1994, 2 years after the hospital closed. No return address. Postmarked Boston. Inside was the Harbinger Master Index, not his copy. His copy was in a safe deposit box in Newton and stayed there. This one was longer. The entries did not stop in 1980. They continued. 1981, 1984, 1988, 1991. The site codes changed. The formatting changed twice. Once to what was clearly a computer printout. And at some point in 1983 the program designation changed as well. Harbinger became Janus. Janus is the Roman god of doorways, of beginnings and endings, and he has 2 faces, one looking forward and one looking back. The Janus entries were different in character, and Corbett, reading them in his kitchen at 65 years old, felt something he had not expected, which was a kind of grim relief. Because Janus did not appear to be running compression protocols. Janus did not appear to have subjects in the sense that Harbinger had subjects. Janus was analytic. It worked from convicted offenders, crime scene documentation, childhood records, unsolved case files. It was studying, at scale, and it was studying things that had already happened. Whatever it was not doing what Sloane had done. And Corbett understood, sitting there, that the story did not have the ending he had spent 30 years constructing. The worst of it really had stopped. Not because anyone was punished. Nobody was ever punished. It stopped because it did not work, and because the world changed around it, and because the knowledge it had been trying to torture out of people turned out to be obtainable, imperfectly, by simply asking men in prison and writing down what they said. The monstrous version had died of uselessness. Some of what it learned had survived into something ordinary. That should have been the end. He was almost at peace with it. Then he turned to the last page. There was a photograph clipped to it. He recognised it immediately, because he had one very like it in a drawer upstairs. It was his own identification photograph taken in September of 1966 on the day he received his keys. 29 years old, bad haircut, looking slightly to the left of the camera. Underneath it, Corbett, Vincent A. Observation began, 1966. The entry ran 11 pages. It contained an assessment of his personality conducted before he ever met Everett Sloane. It described his relationship with his father. It described his tendency toward moral perfectionism, his difficulty with authority when authority was wrong, his need to be the person in the room who noticed. It noted in 1967 that he had begun independently identifying marked files. It predicted in 1968, in a paragraph written after he submitted his 3-page memo, that subject Corbett would not resign, would not escalate through official channels, and would instead pursue private documentation over a period of years while remaining inside the institution, on the grounds that he would come to believe his presence constituted a restraining influence. That is exactly what he did. That is exactly what he did for 12 more years. He sat in his kitchen and read a description, written when he was 31 years old, of the entire remaining shape of his life, and he understood finally what he had been. Not a witness, not an investigator, not the one honest man in a corrupt building, a control. Because if you are running an experiment on what pressure does to violent men, you need to know what the same pressure does to a man who is not violent. You need someone with a strong moral structure placed in a compromising position over a long period, observed continuously to see what he does, whether he breaks, whether he leaves, whether he compromises by degrees, whether the guilt accumulates or dissipates, whether an ordinary decent person, given 18 years of complicity in something he knows is wrong, eventually walks away or eventually adapts. He had been the baseline, and somewhere in the surviving files, in a program that may or may not still exist, in a filing system that has outlived the building and the men who built it, there is a paragraph written decades ago describing what Vincent Corbett is going to do next. He never found out whether it was accurate. He died in 2011, at 84, in a house in Vermont. His papers went to a university archive where they remain uncatalogued in 23 boxes in a basement under a number. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a continent. Not a small one, a genuinely massive one, roughly the size of the United States and Mexico combined. Now imagine that this entire continent is buried under ice. Not a light dusting of winter frost, not the kind of ice you'd find on a frozen lake. Real ice. Ancient ice. Ice that in some places runs nearly 3 miles straight down, compressing everything beneath it under pressures that would crush most engineered materials. Ice that has been accumulating layer by layer for over 34 million years. Now imagine that beneath all of that ice, beneath all of those millions of years of cold, compressed, perfectly preserving darkness, there is a landscape that no human being has ever seen. Not explored, not mapped in person, not touched. Seen. There are mountain ranges down there that are taller than the Alps, buried completely. There are river valleys wider than the Mississippi Basin, carved by water that stopped flowing, millions of years before our species existed. There are lakes, sealed, pressurized, lightless, that have been cut off from the surface of the Earth for longer than any coherent measurement of time in human history can meaningfully represent. This is not a metaphor. This is not a thought experiment. This is a precise and accurate description of a real place on the planet you are currently living on. It is called Antarctica. And the staggering thing, the thing that should genuinely stop you in your tracks when you consider it, is that we talk about it as if we already know it. We say the word like it's a solved problem, like it's an item on a list that has been checked off. Antarctica? Yes. Cold. Penguins. Research stations. Moving on. But the interior of Antarctica has never been seen by human eyes. Not 1 square metre of it. It is as unknown to us as the surface of an alien planet. And if even a fraction of what certain researchers, analysts, explorers and theorists have spent decades quietly pointing to turns out to be accurate, then what is buried beneath the ice of Antarctica is not just geologically significant. It is the most consequential discovery in the entire history of human civilization. A discovery that would rewrite not just archaeology and history, but the story we tell ourselves about what humanity is, what we are capable of, and how long we have been capable of it. This is the story of the Ice Archive. It begins in 1911, with 2 men racing toward the most desolate point on Earth, and it ends, if it ends at all, somewhere beneath the ice, in the darkness, where something may have been waiting for a very, very long time to be found. Act 1. 1911. The race to the bottom of the world. In the early years of the 20th century, there was a particular kind of man who existed in a particular kind of historical moment. A moment when the map of the world still had blank spaces in it, and those blank spaces felt like a personal affront to certain temperaments. These were men for whom the known world was already too small, men who looked at a map and saw not the continents that had been filled in, but the edges where the filling stopped. And in the first decade of the 1900s, there was one blank space left that mattered above all others, the geographic South Pole. Roald Amundsen was Norwegian, and he was methodical in the way that only a certain kind of obsessive can be methodical, the kind where the obsession looks, from the outside, like calm. He had spent years preparing for polar travel. He had studied the Inuit people of the Arctic, learning from them how to build sleds and drive dogs and read ice conditions in ways that European explorers had persistently refused to learn, relying instead on heavy equipment and physical brute force, and the steadfast belief that willpower could substitute for knowledge. Amundsen did not share this belief. He learned. He adapted. He prepared with a thoroughness that bordered on the fanatical. His team set out from their base camp on the Bay of Whales on the 19th of October 1911. 5 men, 52 dogs, 4 sleds. They moved across the Ross Ice Shelf in conditions that would have ended most expeditions before the first week was out. Temperatures dropping to -40, surface winds capable of stripping exposed skin in minutes, crevasses hidden beneath thin snow bridges that could swallow a dog team without warning. Amundsen navigated all of it with an efficiency that seems almost supernatural in retrospect. On the 14th of December 1911, Roald Amundsen and 4 companions, Helmer Hansen, Sverre Hassel, Oscar Wisting and Olav Bjaaland, reached the geographic South Pole. They planted a Norwegian flag. They took measurements to confirm their position. They ate a celebratory meal of seal meat. And then Amundsen did something quietly remarkable. He wrote a letter to King Haakon of Norway and left it in a small tent at the pole, addressed to his rival Robert Falcon Scott, whom he knew would be coming soon. The letter asked Scott to deliver it to the king in the event that Amundsen's team did not survive the return journey. It was the gesture of a man who understood with absolute clarity what kind of place he was standing in. Robert Falcon Scott arrived 34 days later. His team had travelled a different route, using motor sledges that broke down early, ponies that died in the cold, and ultimately their own bodies to haul supplies across terrain that was slowly killing them. When they crested the final rise and saw the Norwegian flag already planted at the pole, Scott wrote in his diary, a diary that would be found beside his frozen body months later, the words that have followed his story ever since. He wrote, "Great God, this is an awful place, and terrible enough for us to have laboured to it without the reward of priority." All 5 members of Scott's polar party died on the return journey. Scott himself perished in his tent on or around the 29th of March, 1912, with his companions Lawrence Oates and Edgar Wilson, in a blizzard approximately 11 miles from a supply depot that might have saved them. His last diary entry, dated the 29th of March, ends mid-sentence. The pen simply stopped moving. But here is the thing about both expeditions that gets lost in the drama of the race itself, something that was noted, filed, and then quietly set aside by the people who came after. Both Amundsen's and Scott's teams reported, in their journals and in post-expedition statements, geographic features that did not quite fit the geological models of the era. Rock formations that seemed, in their words, out of place. Outcroppings of exposed stone along the Transantarctic mountains that appeared almost too regular, too deliberate in their geometry, to be purely the work of wind and ice erosion. Amundsen himself described certain mountain features near the Axel Heiberg Glacier as peculiarly formed, without elaborating further. His expedition geologist, Christian Prestrud, made notes about rock structures that he described as displaying unusual angular consistency, a phrase that, in the geological vocabulary of 1911, was a politely technical way of saying, "This doesn't look quite right." Scott's expedition geologist, Edward Adrian Wilson, was more specific. Wilson was one of the most careful observers on the expedition, a man trained in both medicine and natural science, who had the rare ability to describe what he actually saw rather than what he expected to see. His field notes, which were recovered along with his body, and are now housed in the archives of the Scott Polar Research Institute in Cambridge, contain a passage about certain rock formations in the Queen Alexandra Range that has attracted intermittent attention ever since. Wilson described a series of stone outcroppings that appeared, in his words, to display a regularity of interval and a consistency of angle that seemed improbable as a purely natural formation. He noted them carefully, sketched them in his field journal, and then, because he was dying, because the return journey was consuming everything, because the priority of survival made all other observations academic, moved on. Those sketches are still in Cambridge. The formations they depict have never been revisited. Wilson's observation, improbable as a purely natural formation, has been sitting in an archive in England for over 100 years, waiting for someone to go back and look. Act 2, 1920s through 40s, mapping a continent you cannot see. In the years that followed the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, as historians would later call the period between roughly 1895 and 1922, the world's attention moved elsewhere. There was a world war to fight, then a global influenza pandemic that killed more people in 18 months than the war had killed in 4 years. Then the anxious, glittering instability of the 1920s, and then the economic catastrophe of the 1930s, and then the slow, grinding approach of another war. Antarctica waited. It had been waiting for 34 million years. A few more decades were nothing. But the work of understanding the continent did not entirely stop. In the 1920s and 1930s, as aviation technology matured from the fragile fabric and wire machines of the First World War into genuine instruments of long-range reconnaissance, Antarctica began to be mapped from the air. This changed everything about the pace and scope of what was possible. A man on foot with a dog team could cover 20 miles on a good day. An aircraft could cover 500. What had taken Amundsen months to traverse could now be photographed, in hours. The aerial surveys that began in earnest with Richard Byrd's first Antarctic expedition in 1928 and 1929 revealed something that genuinely surprised even the geologists who had theorized about it. Antarctica was not a featureless dome of ice. It was, beneath the ice, a continent of extraordinary geological complexity and drama. Mountain ranges that rivaled anything in the inhabited world. Valley systems of enormous scale. Coastal configurations of remarkable variety. The ice was not a covering that obscured a flat, dull foundation. It was a covering that concealed an entire world of peaks and valleys and ancient water systems and geological formations whose scale and complexity were only beginning to be appreciated. The Transantarctic Mountains were already known. Their peaks projected above the ice in places and had been visible to the earliest explorers. But aerial photography revealed the true extent of this range. Nearly 3,500 kilometers long, one of the longest continuous mountain chains on Earth, dividing the continent into eastern and western halves with the kind of geological authority that only deep time can produce. East Antarctica, the larger and higher portion, sat on a single ancient continental plate and was believed to be among the oldest stable geological formations on the planet. Rock that had been sitting in essentially its current configuration for billions of years. West Antarctica was younger, more geologically active, and in certain respects more mysterious. But the interior, the vast elevated plateau that occupied the heart of East Antarctica, remained stubbornly, completely opaque. The ice over the interior was simply too thick, too deep, too old to be penetrated by the technology of the era. Every map made of Antarctica during the 1920s, 30s and 40s was, in the most literal sense possible, a map of ice, not of the continent, of the surface. The continent itself, the actual rock, the actual geography, the actual geological history, it was invisible, sealed, inaccessible. And then, in 1913, something turned up in a library in Istanbul that would, decades later, become one of the most debated objects in the entire history of cartography, the Piri Reis map. Hafiz Ahmed Muhiddin Piri, known to history as Piri Reis, the word Reis meaning admiral in Ottoman Turkish, was a naval commander, a cartographer, and an obsessive collector of geographical knowledge. Born around 1465, he spent decades accumulating charts and maps from every source available to him. Portuguese sea captains, Genoese merchants, Arab scholars, Spanish explorers, and, according to his own marginal notations on the map, documents that had their origins in sources considerably older than the age of exploration. In 1513, he assembled much of this accumulated knowledge into a single large map drawn on gazelle skin, showing the Atlantic Ocean and portions of the continent surrounding it. The map was discovered in the Imperial Palace in Istanbul in 1929 during renovation work. It was recognised immediately as historically significant and was studied by cartographers and historians. Most of what it showed was unremarkable, the standard geographical knowledge of early 16th century Europe and the Middle East, competent for its era and no more. But the southern portion of the map, the part that extended below the recognised continents and into the regions where, in 1513, nothing was supposed to be, showed a landmass, a detailed landmass with bays and peninsulas and what appeared to be rivers and mountain ranges, a landmass that sat in roughly the right position relative to the southern continents above it for Antarctica. Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820. The Piri Reis map was drawn in 1513, 307 years earlier. The mainstream explanation has always been that the southern landmass on the Piri Reis map represents the theoretical continent that Renaissance-era cartographers believed must exist in the southern hemisphere to balance the weight of the northern land masses, a concept known as Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, which appeared on European maps for centuries before any actual southern continent was discovered. This is a plausible explanation. It fits the known history of cartographic theory. It does not require any exotic assumption about the origin of the knowledge Piri Reis was drawing on. But there is a detail that the Terra Australis explanation has always struggled to fully account for. In 1960, a professor of history named Charles Hapgood and a group of his students at Keene State College in New Hampshire undertook a systematic analysis of the Piri Reis map, comparing its southern coastline to modern cartographic data. What Hapgood found, and what he published in a book called Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, was that certain portions of the southern coastline on the Piri Reis map corresponded not to the ice-covered coastline of Antarctica as we know it today, but to the geological coastline that would have been present if the Antarctic ice sheet were removed. The subglacial coastline, the actual rock as it would appear without the covering of ice that has been building for the past 34 million years. The debate over this claim has never fully resolved. Mainstream cartographic historians have argued that the correspondences Hapgood identified are the result of selective comparison, and that the overall shape of the Piri Reis southern landmass does not match Antarctica well enough to support Hapgood's conclusions. Hapgood's defenders have argued that the critics are applying an impossibly strict standard of correspondence to a hand-drawn map from the 16th century. Both sides have points. Neither side has definitively won, but the map sits in Istanbul in the Topkapi Palace Museum, and it does not change, and the question it asks does not go away. Act 3. 1946. Operation High Jump and the 8 weeks that nobody has ever explained. In the autumn of 1946, the United States Navy began assembling an expedition to Antarctica that was by any measure extraordinary in its scale. It was called Operation High Jump, and it was led by Rear Admiral Richard Evelyn Byrd, the same man who had conducted the first successful American aerial surveys of Antarctica in the late 1920s, and who had, by the mid-1940s, become the closest thing that American polar exploration had to a living legend. But Operation High Jump was not, in any meaningful sense, a scientific expedition of the kind Byrd had led before. The numbers make this clear immediately. 4,700 military personnel, 13 naval vessels, among them the aircraft carrier USS Philippine Sea and the submarine USS Senate. 23 aircraft, including troop transports, photography planes and flying boats capable of extended ocean reconnaissance. Enough fuel, food and supplies to sustain extended independent operations in one of the most hostile environments on Earth. The financial and logistical resources committed to Operation High Jump exceeded those of many actual military campaigns. Whatever the official mission statement said, this was not primarily a research exercise. The official mission statement said, to consolidate and extend United States sovereignty claims in Antarctica, to train naval personnel in cold weather conditions, to test equipment in polar environments, and to conduct scientific investigations. These are legitimate objectives. None of them, individually or collectively, requires 4,700 personnel and a carrier battle group. Byrd arrived in Antarctica in January of 1947. The operations timeline called for 6 to 8 months of activity. There were structures to establish, surveys to conduct, a massive quantity of aerial photography to accumulate. The expedition was prepared and equipped for a long campaign. The base camp was established. The aircraft began their reconnaissance flights. For several weeks, everything appeared to proceed according to plan. And then, in late February of 1947, roughly 8 weeks into an operation planned for 6 to 8 months, Operation High Jump ended. Abruptly. Completely. The ships turned north and headed home. The official explanation offered by the Navy was unequivocal in its mundanity. The decision to withdraw early was driven by deteriorating weather conditions and the onset of the Antarctic autumn, which made continued operations logistically untenable. This is, on its face, a perfectly reasonable explanation. Antarctic weather is genuinely extreme, and the window of relative accessibility during the southern summer is short. The Navy's logistical assessments were made by experienced officers with direct knowledge of conditions on the ground. It is entirely possible that the decision was exactly what it was described as being, a practical response to practical constraints. And yet certain details of the early withdrawal have proven persistently difficult to square with the purely practical explanation. The expedition had been provisioned and equipped specifically to operate through difficult conditions. The supply loads, the personnel counts, the cold weather gear, all of it had been calibrated for a multi-month campaign that everyone involved knew would include severe weather. The argument that weather forced an early withdrawal from an expedition specifically designed to withstand severe weather requires either accepting that conditions were dramatically worse than any prior modelling had anticipated, or accepting that something else happened. The aerial reconnaissance data gathered during those 8 weeks, thousands of photographs, hours of film, geographic data covering vast portions of the continent's previously unmapped interior, was classified upon the expedition's return to the United States. Portions of this material were declassified over the following decades, but significant quantities of the photographic and survey data from Operation High Jump remain classified to this day. The stated reason, given by successive administrations when the question has been raised, is that the material simply has not been prioritised for review and declassification. Bureaucratic backlog. Nothing deliberate. This may be entirely true. Government archives are vast and understaffed and contain enormous quantities of material that has been classified by default and declassified by no one simply because no one has gotten around to it. The mundane explanation for classified Antarctic aerial photography from 1947 is not impossible. It is, in fact, quite plausible. What is harder to explain is what Admiral Byrd said in the months and years following the expedition's early return. In March of 1947, shortly after the expedition returned to the United States, Byrd gave an interview to a Chilean newspaper called El Mercurio. The interview was conducted in Spanish, and the translation has been a matter of considerable dispute ever since, both because translations inevitably involve interpretive choices, and because the original Spanish text has been cited in different versions by different sources. What is agreed upon is that Byrd made statements about the strategic importance of the polar regions, and about the potential for threats to emerge from unexpected geographic directions. In one widely quoted passage, he appeared to warn of the possibility of aerial attack, in his words, or a version of his words, from pole to pole at incredible speed. In the Cold War context of 1947, this statement was interpreted by most commentators as a reference to Soviet military capabilities and the vulnerability of the American mainland to attack over the Arctic or Antarctic routes. This is a reasonable interpretation. The Cold War was just beginning. The Soviet Union was developing its own nuclear program, and the strategic geography of polar air routes was a genuine military concern of the era. But a subset of researchers, people who have spent years examining the documentary record of Operation High Jump, have argued that the Chilean interview represents something different. That Byrd, a careful and experienced man who chose his public words deliberately, was describing something he had encountered or been briefed on during the expedition itself. Something unexpected. Something that didn't fit the standard geopolitical categories of the time. These claims are unverified. They rely on disputed translations, on second and third-hand accounts, and on a pattern of circumstantial evidence that stops short of anything that could be called proof. Admiral Byrd died in 1957. Whatever he knew, whatever he saw or was told during those 8 weeks in Antarctica went with him. What remains is the gap between what was planned and what happened, the gap between what was collected and what has been released, the gap between the official explanation and the documented facts that the official explanation doesn't quite account for. It is not a dramatic gap. It is not by itself enough to build a theory on, but it is there. It has always been there, and nobody has ever fully closed it. Act 4. 1959. The Treaty and the Silence. It created on the 1st of December 1959, 12 nations signed a document in Washington, D.C. that remains, by virtually any measure, one of the most genuinely remarkable pieces of international diplomacy produced in the 20th century. It was called the Antarctic Treaty, and its core provisions were simple and sweeping. Antarctica would be a zone of peace. Military operations would be prohibited. Nuclear testing would be prohibited. Scientific investigation would be freely shared among all signatories. Territorial claims, several of which overlapped and would, if pursued, have produced conflict, would be frozen in place, neither recognised nor repudiated for the duration of the treaty's existence. The 12 original signatories were Argentina, Australia, Belgium, Chile, France, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, South Africa, the Soviet Union, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Today, the treaty has 54 parties. It is, in the specific and technical sense, a success. Antarctica has been free of military conflict for over 60 years. Its environment has been substantially protected from the resource extraction that has devastated so many other remote ecosystems. The science conducted there, on climate, on atmospheric chemistry, on cosmic ray detection, on the deep history of the Earth's ice record, is genuinely significant and genuinely shared. But treaties are not only what they explicitly say, they are also what they create by implication. And what the Antarctic Treaty created, among other things, was a bureaucratic architecture that makes independent, unsponsored investigation of the continent's interior effectively impossible for any individual or organisation operating outside of the official national programme framework. To operate in Antarctica, you need a national programme to sponsor you. To be sponsored, you need to submit to a review process that evaluates the scientific validity of your proposed work. To have your proposed work judged scientifically valid, you need to frame your questions in ways that the established scientific community recognises as legitimate questions. Do you see the circularity? If the question you want to ask is one that the established scientific community considers illegitimate, if you want to take ground-penetrating radar to a set of coordinates flagged by independent researchers as anomalous, and you want to do it specifically to test the hypothesis that those coordinates might correspond to artificial structures of prehistorical origin, you will not get sponsorship. Not because the question is impossible to investigate, but because it is the wrong kind of question. It is the kind of question that, in the current framework, marks the asker as someone who does not share the community's priors. And people who do not share the community's priors do not get resources. This is not a conspiracy. It is the normal functioning of scientific institutions, which are conservative by design and for excellent reasons. The conservatism of scientific institutions is what prevents resources from being squandered on every fringe hypothesis that passes through, but it is also what creates the conditions under which genuinely anomalous data can go uninvestigated for decades, not because it has been examined and dismissed, but because the institutional gatekeeping prevents it from being examined at all. The question is never asked loudly enough to get an answer, because the people who might answer it have already decided they don't need to. There is a specific region of East Antarctica, a region centred roughly on coordinates that have been discussed in various independent research communities for the past 2 decades, where the Antarctic Treaty's protocol on environmental protection creates a series of overlapping restrictions that make access particularly difficult. The region in question falls within a special protected area designation that limits physical access to scientific personnel with specific approved research objectives. The official reason for the designation is the protection of sensitive geological features from contamination. This is a legitimate conservation objective applied consistently throughout Antarctica. It also means that the specific area flagged by independent analysts as displaying potentially anomalous features in satellite and radar data is among the most legally and practically difficult areas of the entire continent to physically investigate. Whether by design or by accident, the geography of access restrictions on Antarctica tends to align in interesting ways with the geography of the questions that are least welcome. Act 5. 2012. The lake that should not exist and the life that lives in it. Of all the discoveries made in Antarctica in the modern scientific era, Lake Vostok is the one that changed the most about what we thought we knew. Not just about Antarctica, but about the nature of life itself and the range of environments in which it can persist. It is also, in a way that its discoverers may not have fully intended, one of the most powerful pieces of evidence for the argument that the Antarctic interior may contain things that our current models of the continent's history cannot account for. Lake Vostok was theorized in the 1960s by Russian geographer Andrei Kapitsa, who was analyzing seismic data from Soviet Antarctic research stations and noticed anomalies in the readings that suggested a large body of liquid water beneath the ice. The theory was refined and expanded over the following decades as technology improved and additional data became available. By the 1990s, it was reasonably well established that a major subglacial lake existed beneath the Vostok station in East Antarctica. The lake's existence was confirmed by satellite radar altimetry in 1993. What the full picture revealed, as the data accumulated, was this. Lake Vostok is approximately 250 kilometres long and 50 kilometres wide, making it roughly the size of Lake Ontario. It sits beneath approximately 3.7 kilometres of ice. It has been completely sealed from the surface atmosphere for an estimated 15 to 25 million years. The pressure of the ice above it keeps the water liquid despite temperatures that would otherwise produce ice. The lake exists in a state of geological thermodynamic equilibrium that has been stable for longer than the human genus has existed. Think about what that means. A body of water larger than Lake Ontario, sealed from the world for 25 million years, in complete darkness, under pressure that would crush most submarines. In 2012, a Russian drilling team working out of Vostok Station made contact with the lake water, a feat of engineering that had been attempted for decades and had been halted repeatedly by technical problems, international controversy over potential contamination of a pristine environment, and the simple physical difficulty of drilling nearly 4 kilometres through ice under Antarctic conditions. When the drill finally broke through, the water, pressurised from above by the weight of the ice, shot up the drill hole and flash froze, creating a column of refrozen lake water that the scientists then extracted and analysed. What they found in that water created a debate that has not fully resolved itself. The initial bacterial DNA analysis found sequences that did not match any known organism in the international databases. The Russian scientists initially described these sequences with considerable caution, noting that they might represent either genuinely novel microbial life forms evolved in complete isolation over millions of years, or contamination introduced during the drilling process. Subsequent analysis produced conflicting results. Different research groups using different methodologies reached different conclusions. The contamination hypothesis was neither conclusively proven nor conclusively eliminated. What was confirmed, through multiple independent analyses, was that Lake Vostok is biologically active. Life of some kind is present in the lake water, life that has been evolving in conditions of total darkness, total isolation, and extreme pressure for millions of years. Life that bears no close relationship to any surface ecosystem we know of. Life that, in a very specific and profound sense, represents a parallel branch of the tree of life, a branch that split off from the main trunk before the ice closed over it, and has been developing in isolation ever since. Lake Vostok is not the only subglacial lake in Antarctica. As ground-penetrating radar surveys have expanded through the late 1990s, 2000s, and 2010s, the picture of what lies beneath the Antarctic ice sheet has grown steadily more complex and more strange. There are now over 400 confirmed or likely subglacial lakes catalogued beneath the Antarctic ice. Some of them are connected to each other by subglacial rivers and drainage networks. Some of them are ancient, sealed for millions of years like Vostok. Others are dynamic, filling and draining on timescales of years to decades, driven by the movement of the ice above them and the geothermal heat from below. Beneath the ice of West Antarctica, radar surveys have revealed what geologists now call the Gamburtsev subglacial mountains, a mountain range buried entirely beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, with peaks reaching up to 2,700 metres above sea level. No peak of the Gamburtsev range is visible above the ice. The entire range exists in complete darkness, sealed under kilometres of ice, and would be among the most dramatic mountain landscapes on Earth if you could somehow see it. No human being ever has. And in 2016, a collaborative radar survey of West Antarctica mapped something that generated significant scientific interest. a vast subglacial canyon system running from the interior of the continent to the coast, over 1,000 kilometres long and in places over 3 kilometres deep. The canyon is ancient. It was carved by rivers that once ran openly across a temperate Antarctic landscape, draining toward a coast that was, at the time, something like a temperate shoreline. The canyon is a fossil of a world that existed before the ice came. It is the most comprehensive single piece of physical evidence we have for the fact that Antarctica was once profoundly, completely, unrecognisably different from what it is today. A world before the freeze, a world that was warm and wet, and in which, if the conditions were right, and the timeline overlaps in the ways that some researchers believe it might, something could have lived, something complex, something that built things. Act 6. The deep past before the ice. What Antarctica once was. To fully understand the ice archive theory, to understand why it is more than simply a conspiracy fantasy, why it has the structure of a genuine scientific hypothesis, even if it lacks the evidence to confirm it, you need to spend some time with the geological history of Antarctica. Not the recent history, not the last few thousand years, but the deep history. The history that is measured not in centuries or millennia, but in tens of millions of years. Because that history is, in certain specific ways, genuinely extraordinary. And it establishes a factual foundation for a question that mainstream archaeology has not yet been willing to seriously ask. Approximately 180 million years ago, Antarctica was part of a vast supercontinent that geologists call Gondwana. Gondwana included what would eventually become Antarctica, Australia, South America, Africa, India, and the Arabian Peninsula, all connected in a single landmass that straddled the southern portion of the globe. The climate of Gondwana's Antarctic region during this period was temperate to subtropical. There were forests of conifers and ferns, there were rivers and lakes, there were animals, dinosaurs in the later periods of Gondwana's existence, and the full range of Mesozoic life that characterised the warm, oxygen-rich world of that era. We know this not from inference but from direct evidence. Fossil forests have been found in Antarctica, actual preserved wood and leaf material from trees that grew there hundreds of millions of years ago. Dinosaur fossils have been recovered from Antarctic rock formations, including the remains of species closely related to dinosaurs found in South America and Africa, confirming the continental connection. The Antarctic rock record, where it is accessible beneath the ice, is a direct physical record of this ancient warm world. Gondwana began breaking apart approximately 180 million years ago, driven by the tectonic forces that gradually separate and reconfigure Earth's crustal plates over geological time. Antarctica slowly drifted southward toward its current polar position. As it moved away from the other fragments of Gondwana, the ocean currents that had been moderating its climate began to change. The Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a vast continuous oceanic circulation that flows around the continent with no major landmass to interrupt it, became established, and the Antarctic Circumpolar Current acts as a thermal isolator, preventing the warmer waters of the lower latitudes from reaching the continental shelf and moderating the polar temperatures. Once the circumpolar current was established, Antarctica was committed to a trajectory of cooling that could only go one direction. The glaciation of Antarctica began roughly 34 million years ago. It was not instantaneous. Nothing in geology is instantaneous, but in geological terms it was relatively rapid, progressing from scattered highland glaciers to a continent-wide ice sheet over a period of perhaps a few million years. By 34 million years ago, the basic structure of the Antarctic ice sheet that exists today was established. The forests were gone, the rivers were sealed, the ancient warm world was buried. But here is the crucial detail that the ice archive theory turns on. 34 million years is a geological time frame. In human terms, it is essentially incomprehensible, but it is not the relevant time frame. The relevant time frame is much, much more recent. The last major ice age, the Pleistocene glaciation, reached its maximum extent approximately 26,000 years ago and then began to retreat. Sea levels were over 100 metres lower than they are today because so much water was locked up in ice. The great ice sheets of North America and Northern Europe covered millions of square kilometres. The global climate was dramatically different from anything recorded in human historical memory. And Antarctica, during this period and in the millennia that followed the last glacial maximum, experienced its own variations. West Antarctica in particular, the portion of the continent sitting on a collection of islands and archipelagos, rather than a single solid continental plate, had a different relationship to the ice than the more stable East Antarctic plateau. Certain coastal and sub-coastal regions of West Antarctica may have had periods of relative accessibility, periods when the ice was thinner, when coastal margins were exposed, when the environment was less absolutely hostile than it is today. The human timeline intersects with this in a way that is uncomfortable for standard archaeological models. Anatomically, modern Homo sapiens have existed for approximately 300,000 years. For the vast majority of that time, our species was confined to Africa and, gradually, to the warmer portions of Asia and Europe. The colonization of the Americas, now dated to at least 20,000 years ago, and possibly significantly earlier, demonstrated that our ancestors were capable of extraordinarily long-range migration through environments that make modern Antarctica look almost hospitable by comparison. People crossed the Bering Land Bridge or travelled along the Pacific coast by watercraft, through conditions of brutal cold and near-total scarcity, to reach entirely new continents. The question the Ice Archive theory asks is not whether anatomically modern humans definitely reached Antarctica before the historical period. It is whether the possibility can be excluded, and when you examine the question carefully, when you look at the human timeline, at the capability of early maritime cultures, at the evidence for long-range oceanic travel in the ancient world at the periods when portions of Antarctica may have been more accessible than they are today, the honest answer is no. The possibility cannot be excluded. It is unlikely. It is unconfirmed, but it is not impossible. And if it happened, if even a small group of people of whatever cultural sophistication reached the Antarctic coast and built even the simplest permanent structures before the ice closed over them, those structures might still be there. The ice does not destroy, it preserves. Organic material has been recovered from Antarctic ice in conditions of near-perfect preservation after hundreds of thousands of years. Stone structures, built to any reasonable standard of permanence, would survive indefinitely under those conditions. The archive, if it exists, has been waiting for the better part of human history. It has been waiting in the cold and the dark, perfectly preserved, for the day when someone with the right technology asks the right question in the right place. Act 7. The geometric problem, the shapes that nature is not supposed to make. In 2013, satellite imagery that had been publicly available for several years was re-examined by a group of independent researchers who had been applying themselves to the specific question of anomalous formations on the Antarctic ice surface and in the subglacial terrain beneath it. What they identified, or rather, what they identified as worth discussing publicly, became one of the most widely shared and most hotly disputed Antarctic stories of that decade, the so-called Antarctic pyramids. Four-sided structures, visible in satellite imagery of a region of the Ellsworth Mountains, displaying what appeared to be an unmistakably pyramidal profile. Geologists have a standard and entirely adequate explanation for these formations, and it is important to understand it before understanding why some people find it insufficient. The structures are called nunataks, a term borrowed from Greenlandic Inuit, meaning a rocky peak projecting above an ice sheet. Nunataks are common in Antarctica. They form when mountain peaks project above the surrounding ice, and are shaped over long periods by the process of glacial erosion. Specifically, they are shaped by what geologists call arete formation, the process by which glaciers carve into the sides of a mountain from multiple directions simultaneously, leaving a sharp ridge, or, if the process is sufficiently regular from all sides, a pyramidal peak. The Matterhorn in Switzerland is the most famous example in the inhabited world. It looks like a pyramid because it is a natural pyramid, created by glacial erosion, and no one suggests otherwise. The Antarctic pyramidal formations look similar. Geologists point to this and say, natural pyramidal peaks formed by glacial erosion, fully accounted for. End of discussion. Except that the researchers who have examined these specific formations most carefully are not arguing against the geological explanation for how the shapes were created. They are asking a different, more specific question. Why do multiple pyramidal formations of unusually precise geometry cluster together in this particular region? And why do some of them display angular consistency and dimensional relationships that seem, to a trained eye applying rigorous geometric analysis rather than intuitive impression, to exceed what random glacial erosion would be expected to produce? Natural pyramidal peaks form under natural conditions that vary continuously from location to location. They are not typically consistent with each other in their dimensions or their angular relationships. They are products of local conditions, local wind patterns, local ice flow rates, local rock types, and those local conditions produce variation. What the Antarctic pyramid researchers have found, in their most careful analyses, is a degree of geometric consistency across multiple formations that seems statistically improbable under purely random natural conditions. This is a subtle argument, and it requires careful handling. Pattern recognition is one of the things human beings do most readily and least reliably. We find faces in clouds, messages in static, meaningful arrangements in the positions of stars. The history of human perception is saturated with false pattern recognition, and the specific domain of geometric formations that might be artificial is one of the most contaminated areas in this history, full of claims that collapsed under scrutiny. The researchers making the Antarctic geometry argument are aware of this. The better ones acknowledge it explicitly and attempt to quantify their geometric analysis in ways that can be checked and challenged. There is also a broader, less visible dimension to the subglacial geometry argument, one that gets less attention because it requires familiarity with ground-penetrating radar data rather than the more accessible satellite imagery. Ground-penetrating radar surveys of certain regions of the Antarctic ice sheet have produced subsurface images that some analysts have described as displaying geometrically regular features at depths consistent with burial under significant ice. Features that appear as linear or rectilinear elements in the radar returns, at scales too large to be easily attributed to geological noise. The interpretation of ground-penetrating radar data is a technical skill, and the images involved are not the kind of striking visual evidence that can be immediately grasped by a general audience. But the people raising these concerns are in several cases not amateurs. They include radar analysts with professional backgrounds in remote sensing and geophysics, people who have spent careers interpreting exactly this kind of data, and who are not inclined toward wishful thinking about what the patterns mean. Their concern is not that they have found a pyramid. Their concern is that certain features in the data are inconsistent with the geological context in ways that they cannot fully explain, and that the inconsistencies cluster in specific regions rather than being randomly distributed across the dataset. The mainstream scientific response to these analyses has been, to put it plainly, a non-response. The specific anomalies identified by independent researchers have not, as far as public record indicates, been the subject of dedicated follow-up investigation by the national Antarctic programs, with the resources and access to conduct such investigations. The question has not been formally asked. The data has been noted and set aside. The institutional structure of Antarctic science has, by default, decided that the question is not worth asking. Perhaps it isn't. Perhaps the anomalies are fully accounted for by geological processes that have not yet been applied to their interpretation. Perhaps a dedicated study would produce a perfectly satisfying explanation that would put the question to rest permanently. Perhaps. But perhaps is not the same as we've looked and there's nothing there. It means we haven't looked, and that distinction matters. Act 8. The data gaps, the holes in the map that nobody has, filled in the current era when satellite technology has advanced to the point where commercial imagery companies can provide sub-meter resolution photography of virtually any point on the Earth's surface on demand. The idea that significant portions of a continental landmass might be systematically unavailable, in publicly accessible imaging databases seems almost anachronistic. We live in the age of Google Earth. We can zoom in on individual houses, read the names of streets in remote villages, watch the shadow of a cloud move across a mountain range in near real time. The idea that there are places the satellites don't show seems like it belongs to a different technological era. And yet, in the publicly available satellite imagery of Antarctica, they are there. Not everywhere, not uniformly, but persistently enough, and in specific enough locations to have attracted the attention of multiple independent researchers working from different data sets at different times and reaching similar conclusions, blurred regions, patches where the resolution drops suddenly and sharply, areas where what appears to be continuous imaging data is actually discontinuous, where the visual information becomes vague and granular and indistinct at precisely the locations where you would most want clarity. The technical explanations for Antarctic imaging anomalies are real and well documented. Polar orbit geometry means that some areas of Antarctica are imaged with different frequencies than others. The extreme reflectivity of a snow-covered surface creates imaging artifacts that are difficult to correct for. Atmospheric conditions, cloud cover, ice crystal suspension, the specific optical properties of polar air, interfere with imaging in ways that are qualitatively different from the interference encountered at lower latitudes. The challenges of producing high-quality, consistent imagery of Antarctica are genuine, and they account for a significant proportion of the data, gaps and resolution inconsistencies visible in public imagery platforms, but not all of them, and the distribution of the unexplained anomalies is not random. This is the key claim made by the researchers who have spent the most time on this question. If the imaging anomalies were the product of purely technical factors, orbit geometry, atmospheric interference, processing limitations, they would be distributed across the continent in ways that corresponded to those technical factors. Areas at certain latitudes or under certain atmospheric conditions would be systematically underrepresented. The distribution of gaps would be predictable based on known technical parameters. What some researchers have found, when they have mapped the distribution of imaging anomalies against the technical factors that should account for them, is that the correspondence is imperfect, that certain inland regions display data gaps that are more consistent and more persistent than the technical factors alone would predict, that some of the blurred areas correspond with uncomfortable precision to coordinates identified in other datasets as potentially anomalous, that the gaps appear not as the product of random technical limitation, but as the product of something more systematic, something that follows a geographic logic rather than a purely technical one. The satellite imagery anomalies are perhaps the most contentious element of the ice archive theory, because they require a level of technical expertise to evaluate that most people do not have, and because the people with that expertise who work within official channels have generally declined to engage publicly with the independent researchers' claims. This leaves the question in an uncomfortable epistemic limbo. The claims are specific enough to be in principle falsifiable, but the process of falsification requires exactly the kind of institutional engagement that has not been forthcoming. In 2019, a researcher working independently published an analysis of publicly available satellite imagery from multiple platforms, including both commercial providers and government-operated systems, that identified a set of coordinates in East Antarctica where the imaging data from different sources was inconsistent in ways that he argued could not be explained by technical factors. At the same coordinates, ground-penetrating radar data from a published scientific survey showed anomalous subsurface features. At the same coordinates, the Antarctic Treaty's environmental protection protocols placed the region within a restricted access designation. The convergence of imaging anomaly, radar anomaly, and access restriction at a single location was, in the researcher's assessment, more than coincidental. His paper was not published in a peer-reviewed journal. It was not formally refuted. It was simply ignored by the official scientific community. It circulates in independent research networks and has been cited by other independent researchers who have attempted to follow up on the coordinates with their own data analysis. It has not been examined on the ground. The coordinates sit in Antarctica, under the ice, under the restrictions, inaccessible and uninvestigated. Act Act 9. The hidden discoverers, the people who have been asking and what happened to them. The history of Antarctic anomaly. Research is not a history of isolated cranks shouting into the void. It is a history of people with genuine credentials and genuine methodological seriousness who encountered something in the data that they could not fully explain, said so publicly, and found that the institutional response was not engagement but silence. Understanding that history is essential to understanding why the ice archive theory has persisted and grown, rather than dissolving under the pressure of official refutation, because the official refutation has, in most cases, never come. Charles Hapgood, the historian who published the most systematic early analysis of the Peary Race map's southern coastline, was a professor at a respected American institution, and corresponded about his findings with Albert Einstein, who wrote a foreword to one of his books expressing genuine interest in the hypothesis. Einstein did not endorse Hapgood's conclusions. He was careful to frame his support as intellectual encouragement rather than scientific validation, but he did not dismiss them, and he found the geographical arguments interesting enough to engage with seriously. Hapgood's methodology has been criticised by subsequent researchers, and some of his specific cartographic claims have been challenged in ways that require responses his work did not fully anticipate. But the core question he raised, what was the source of the geographical knowledge on the Peary Race map, has never been definitively answered. Rand and Rose Flemath, a Canadian couple who spent decades researching the possibility of a pre-Ice Age Antarctic civilization, published a book in 1995 called When the Sky Fell that made a detailed argument, drawing on Hapgood's earlier work and on geological, anthropological and mythological evidence for the existence of an advanced civilization in Antarctica before the last glaciation. Their methodology was unorthodox, their conclusions were dramatic, and their reception in academic archaeology was predictably cold. But their research was not sloppy. They engaged seriously with the geological record, with the mythology of cultures around the world that contained flood narratives, and references to a lost paradise in the southern seas, and with the cartographic anomalies that Hapgood had identified. Their book has never been formally refuted in the peer-reviewed literature. It has simply been ignored. Graham Hancock, a British journalist and author who has spent 30 years making the case for what he calls a lost civilization destroyed by a cosmic impact or catastrophic geophysical event at the end of the last ice age, incorporated Antarctica into his hypothesis in his 2015 book Magicians of the Gods and his 2019 follow-up America Before. Hancock is not a scientist, and his claims have attracted fierce criticism from archaeologists and geologists who argue that he misrepresents evidence, overstates the certainty of his conclusions, and provides a framework that gives credibility to fringe ideas without providing the rigorous verification that those ideas require. These are legitimate criticisms. Hancock's work is journalistic rather than scientific, and the standards of evidence it applies are not always the standards that peer-reviewed science requires. But here is the thing about the critics. In the decades since Hancock and Flemath and Hapgood raised their questions, the definitive archaeological and geological investigation that would settle those questions has not been conducted. The sites that Hancock points to as evidence of an advanced prehistorical civilization, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, the Onaguni structure off the coast of Japan, the underwater formations off the coast of India, have been studied with varying degrees of thoroughness, and in several cases the studies have produced results that are more ambiguous than the official dismissals of Hancock's claims would suggest. Göbekli Tepe, which was entirely unknown to archaeology when Hancock first wrote about it, turned out to be real, and was dated to approximately 11,600 years ago, at a time when, according to the Standard Model, no civilization complex enough to build a monumental stone temple should have existed. The Standard Model has been revised to accommodate Göbekli Tepe. It has not, however, been revised to accommodate the question of what else might be out there, waiting to be found. The people asking questions about Antarctica are not all conspiracy theorists. Some of them are. But some of them are people with genuine expertise in relevant fields who have found themselves unable to explain certain features of the available data using the standard models, and who have had the intellectual honesty to say so. They deserve better than silence. The questions they are raising deserve better than the institutional non-response they have received. Not because their conclusions are necessarily correct, but because the proper response to an anomaly is investigation, not dismissal. Act 10. The stakes. What it would mean. If any of this were true, let us take the Ice Archive hypothesis seriously for a moment. Not credulously, seriously. Let us ask, with the full weight of what we know about history and geology and human nature, what the confirmation of an artificial structure beneath the Antarctic ice would actually mean. Not for the conspiracy theorists who would feel vindicated, not for the mainstream archaeologists who would feel their worldview challenged, but for humanity, for the actual, practical, existential stakes of the discovery. The most immediate consequence would be archaeological. The timeline of human civilization would require complete revision. The current consensus holds that complex, organised human society began to emerge approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago in the Fertile Crescent of the Middle East, where the combination of a favourable climate, domesticable plant and animal species, and a population density sufficient to support specialisation created the conditions for the first cities, the first writing, the first recorded history. This model is not guesswork. It is based on an enormous body of archaeological evidence accumulated over more than a century of fieldwork on every inhabited continent. It is robust, it is well supported, and it would, in its broad outlines, need to be reconsidered from the ground up if evidence emerged of a structurally sophisticated civilization predating it by tens of thousands of years. The reconsidering would not simply push the dates back. It would require a rethinking of the mechanisms by which civilizations develop and collapse. If an advanced civilization existed in Antarctica before the last glaciation and was destroyed by the advancing ice, then we are looking at a model of civilizational development and collapse that has no analogue in the recorded historical period. A model in which a civilization can rise to significant complexity and then be so completely eliminated, so thoroughly erased by geological processes that it leaves no trace in any of the locations where our archaeology has been looking. This is not impossible, but it requires a substantial revision of what we think we know about the relationship between civilization and the geological record. The second consequence would be mythological, and this one is, in some ways, more uncomfortable than the archaeological one. Virtually every major human culture, on every continent, has a tradition of a lost golden age, a time before the current world when civilization was older and wiser and more complete than it has become. The Greek tradition of Atlantis is the most famous in the Western world, but it is far from unique. The Mesopotamian traditions of the antediluvian kings, rulers who lived before the flood for impossibly long periods, presiding over a civilization of extraordinary sophistication, parallel the Atlantis narrative in striking ways. The Hindu concept of the Satya Yuga, the golden age of complete truth and righteousness that existed before the current degraded era, has structural similarities to both. Indigenous traditions from South America, from the Pacific Islands, from sub-Saharan Africa, from North America, many of them contain echoes of a world before, a world that was lost, a world that is waiting to be recovered. Comparative mythologists have long debated whether these parallel traditions represent independent cultural inventions of a recurring human narrative structure, or whether they preserve genuine historical memory of a real catastrophe. The end of Pleistocene megafauna extinctions, the rapid sea level rise associated with deglaciation, the collapse of Ice Age coastal cultures whose settlements now lie beneath hundreds of meters of ocean water. The question has never been settled, partly because the evidence is thin, and partly because the academic consensus has been reluctant to take seriously the idea that oral traditions could preserve accurate historical information over periods of 10,000 or more years. If the Ice Archive theory is correct, these traditions might be doing exactly that. They might be the last echoes of a civilization's memory of itself, preserved not in stone or clay or papyrus, but in the most durable medium available to a pre-literate culture, the human voice carrying stories forward, from generation to generation across 10 millennia, distorted by time and translation and the normal processes of mythological elaboration, but retaining at their core a kernel of genuine historical memory. The memory of a world that existed before the ice came, a world that was lost, a world that is, perhaps, waiting beneath the ice of Antarctica to be found again. The third consequence would be institutional, and it would be the most immediately disruptive of all, because the confirmation of a prehistorical Antarctic civilization would not simply be a scientific discovery. It would be a political event of the first order. It would immediately raise questions about the history of who knew what and when, about the classified materials from Operation High Jump that have never been released, about the access restrictions that have kept certain Antarctic regions effectively uninvestigated for decades, about the gap between what official science has said about Antarctica and what independent researchers have been suggesting for years. It would raise, in short, the one question that institutional power always finds most dangerous. What else have you not told us? And that question, once asked loudly enough, is very difficult to put back in its box. This is why the softest version of the suppression hypothesis, not active conspiracy, but institutional inertia combined with unconscious avoidance of uncomfortable questions, is actually more plausible and more disturbing than the dramatic version. Active conspiracies require coordination, and coordination is difficult to sustain over generations. But the accumulated weight of institutional conservatism, of funding priorities, of professional incentives that reward asking safe questions and punish asking dangerous ones, this requires no coordination at all. It sustains itself automatically through the normal operation of human institutions. It does not need to be planned, it does not need to be maintained. It simply is. Epilogue. The vault at the bottom of the world. Tonight, as you listen to this, Antarctica exists exactly as it always has. The temperature at the geographic South Pole is somewhere between -50 and -80 degrees Celsius. The wind moves across the plateau in a constant low roar that researchers at the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station describe, after a while, as a kind of presence, something you stop consciously hearing but never stop feeling. The darkness at this time of year is absolute, not the soft darkness of a bedroom with curtains drawn, not the imperfect darkness of a city night sky. The darkness of a place that has been dark in the long winter months for as long as anything on the surface of this planet can remember. Beneath the researchers sleeping in their insulated bunks at the scattered stations that dot the continent's edge and interior, beneath the ice that has been accumulating and compressing and preserving for 34 million years, the landscape that no human being has ever seen continues to exist. The Gamburtsev Mountains rise in their sealed darkness, their peaks never touched by light. The subglacial lakes lie still and black and pressurized, their ancient water hosting life that has been evolving in complete isolation since before our genus existed. The river valleys carved by ancient water hold their shapes in the ice dark, patient as the stone they are made of, and possibly in certain coordinates that certain researchers have marked on certain maps that certain institutions have not examined. Something else waits as well. The ice is not permanent. This is the thing that the current geological moment makes undeniable. The Antarctic ice sheet has been stable for millions of years, but it is not infinitely stable, and the climate forcing that is now being applied to it by human industrial activity is not within the range of natural variation that has characterized the relatively stable climate of the past 12,000 years. The ice is losing mass, the glaciers are accelerating. The West Antarctic ice sheet, the portion of the continent most vulnerable to warming ocean temperatures, is in a process of destabilization whose endpoint is the subject of significant scientific debate, but whose direction is not. The ice will melt. Not all of it. Not quickly. Not on a human timeline that any of us alive today will fully witness. But the process is underway. The archive is being opened, slowly, from the bottom up. What will emerge as the ice retreats is, at this moment, genuinely unknown. The geological record alone will be extraordinary. A pristine, uncontaminated record of the Earth's climate and atmosphere, stretching back millions of years, preserved in the ice itself and in the ancient landscapes that the ice has covered. The biological discoveries alone will almost certainly include organisms unlike anything in the current database of life, organisms that have been evolving in sealed lakes and subglacial environments for timescales that make the entire history of human civilization look like a single afternoon. The pure scientific value of whatever is beneath the Antarctic ice, independent of any hypothesis about ancient civilizations, is beyond calculation. And if there is something else down there, something that was made rather than grown, something that has angles too precise for natural processes and dimensions, too consistent for geological accident, something that someone built long ago, before the ice came and sealed it in the greatest preservative medium the planet has to offer. If that is there, it will be found. The ice will give it up eventually. The technology will reach it eventually. The question will become too urgent to defer eventually. And when it is found, when the first person stands in front of a structure that was built by human hands before the dawn of recorded history in a place that should be empty, in a continent that should contain nothing but ice and rock, the word that will be used to describe that moment will not be discovery. It will be confirmation. Confirmation of something that certain people, with certain data and certain instincts and certain willingness to ask the questions that the institutional world preferred not to answer, had been pointing toward for a very long time. Confirmation that the archive was always there, that history does not always surface quickly, that the most important secrets are sometimes kept not by conspiracies, but by ice. There is a word that archaeologists use for a site identified as potentially significant, but not yet excavated. They call it a known unknown, a place where history may be waiting intact beneath the surface. Antarctica in its entirety, all 14 million square kilometres of it, all 3 miles of its ice, is the largest known unknown on Earth, and it is ours to find when we are finally ready to look